Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the In Tune interview, where we talk with composers about the music they compose. I am Bryan, and joining me today is not my brother, but a different brother, Will Brueggemann. Hello, Will. How are you doing?
Hi, Bryan. I'm so glad to be back on the show. It really feels like it's been such a long time.
Listeners, you may know Will from a lot of different things. As you can tell, you might have heard his brother Carl has been submitting the Root Note segments over the past few months. We've had them on as the Super Marcato Brothers several times, and they are a pair of brothers who create video game music and create video game tribute music, which we'll go into later, and also host a video game music podcast. So they have a lot of shared interests. There's a lot of reasons we love these guys.
So you can see why we'd all be friends.
Exactly. We met up at the last MagFest as well.
Yeah, that was a really fun time. I had so much fun getting to meet you guys because the cool thing about, doing a podcast and just, I guess, the 21st century in general is that you can build these long-lasting friendships, relationships with people completely online. So it was the first time we met, but we were already friends.
So, Will, for people who are less acquainted with you, go ahead and introduce yourself and who you are in the video game music scene.
Yeah, well, like Bryan said, my brother Carl and I co-host a video game music podcast under the moniker Super Marcato Bros. And after, a few years of doing that, we started to use that name to compose original music ourselves for, independent games, and created these tribute albums, which essentially we make our own soundtracks in the style of games that we love, whether it's Super Mario Brothers or Sonic. Carl's really known for his albums called Sonic-esque. I did something a couple years ago called Child of the Chozo, which is this sort of comprehensive tribute album to the music of Metroid. What makes those, I think, unique is that they're not remixes of existing compositions. They're brand new pieces of music written in the style of those phenomenal soundtracks that we love. So it's really a fun process. It's a learning experience to try to get inside the mind of those composers and study the musical style of, say, Koji Kondo and Kenji Yamamoto and people like that, to understand what their musical expression is in a broad sense, and not necessarily about trying to imitate or, mimic specific melodies or chord sequences or stuff like that.
Yeah, I think the best way I heard it described, I think either you or Carl once said, it's like, imagine a world where these were the same composers with the same influences and with the same technological limitations, but they just composed a different soundtrack for the game. So you listen to like a Super Metroid soundtrack or a Super Mario World soundtrack. It could literally be the same as the game music. Like all the samples and sounds are exactly the same, but the melodies and compositions are new. It's a really fascinating idea.
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of thing we just did it. We didn't know if there would be an audience for it and if it's something that anyone would enjoy. It was just sort of, for whatever reason, it felt natural for us to want to do, because I think there's so many games with entirely unique aesthetic qualities. I can be listening to a piece from Super Metroid and know that it's only from Super Metroid. There's nothing else in the entire world that sounds like that. And I don't just mean those melodies and those chords, but just the musical aesthetics that are communicated. So I think it was sort of natural for us.
Yeah.
People often say about artists, you kind of create, or whether it's music, you compose what you want to hear. As a composer, I always kind of see myself as being a listener first. I write the kind of music that I want to hear more of. And I think in terms, when it comes to a lot of the video game music stuff, it's just all about what I grew up with and the music that really spoke to me, and just wanting to challenge myself to be better as a composer so I can kind of break down those soundtracks. And by creating something new, it simultaneously serves as a means of paying tribute to what I love and really being a love letter to these composers who I idolize.
Right. Yeah, I think it really speaks to the background you have with music and how you look at music and how you, remix or rearrange in this case, because some remixers come at it from like a production standpoint. They know electronic music really well, or they know how to mix and master music really well. So they take a song and then they just make it sound, 1,000 times better with modern technology.
Yeah, this is almost the opposite of that. It's trying to create something brand new that sounds like the old thing, where I think a lot of remixes are about taking the existing thing and creating something new out of it, where this is like the opposite. You're taking something new and creating something like old, or something that sounds like it's already existed before. By explaining it, it almost sounds like, why would you want to do that? I can't explain it. It's really, to me, it seemed like the coolest thing in the world. Like, if I could have found that on the internet, like I would have, gone insane, because it would have been exactly what I wanted. Like, the idea of a lost NES soundtrack, the idea of, uncovering a new whole, I guess, album of Super Mario Brothers music. I mean, that would have meant so much to me. So even though, we didn't really know if there'd be an audience, and a lot of the stuff I do, there's no guarantee that people are really listening, but I think it was just the idea that it interested me. And also, I think it really pushed me to do good work, because it wasn't just, at the end of the day, I wasn't making music with solely my identity attached to it. It was making music saying, this is what I love about, Koji Kondo, or, Minami Matsumai, or all these wonderful composers, that the idea is sort of, we have to step up to the challenge to try to hopefully match in some way what those great artists can do.
I think it really speaks to your background as a composer and analyzing music. Going back to little child Will, as you were growing up, you got to music pretty early, right?
I'm the youngest of 4 children, and I'm the youngest by quite a bit. Carl, who's, another Marcato brother, he's my next closest sibling, and we have an 8-year gap. And then Marty, who I'm also very close to, who's a fabulous composer, he's 12 years older than I am. Our sister, she's in between Carl and Marty, and she sings and stuff, but she was never really into composing. But our whole family has always just been so musical. So there was almost no choice for me. As a kid, you sang, you learned music. It was just what we did. And I think Martin was very influenced by our parents and their tastes, and they just happened to, it was really important to sort of instill in him, I guess, the idea of sort of being a Renaissance man, and the idea that you could be good at all sorts of different disciplines. So I think growing up, it never felt like we were the music household. It felt like we were just like the entertainment household. Like, we knew everything about movies and music and video games, and just like anything entertainment, anything pop culture and media. For whatever reason, our family really consumed it. So I just sort of grew up under that background, and music was just a part of it. And I think as Carl and Marty really began to focus down on music as their principal pursuit, as what they were going to make their life's vocation, I just learned a lot by osmosis from hanging out with them and hearing them learn and talk about stuff. So it was just, I think, a really good sort of cesspool for my early, creative mind, if you want to call it. So I think my early attempts at music were influenced by the music that I loved growing up, but a lot of that was really things that my brothers created. I mean, I remember when Carl was in college, I used to just adore the bands he would play in, and I would listen to their CDs, and I would try to figure out how to play their songs on the piano. And the same with Marty. I mean, I just adore, to this day, I still think he's a genius. And I would figure out how to play his pieces on the piano, the same that I would, something by John Williams or Koji Kondo. So I think that's the other thing that helped, is when the musicians you really like are in your family, that means you can learn from them. And that means if there's something in a specific song that you really like and you really respond to, I could just ask Marty, what are you doing there? What's that chord? Why does this feel so satisfying? And they both taught me a great deal. And so it's kind of surreal to me, and this wonderful kind of joy that now that we're all old enough, we get to make music together as collaborators and peers. Is something I could have only dreamed of when I was a little kid.
Yeah, that's so cool. And there's also a certain, like, I don't necessarily want to say competitive because that often has a negative context to it. But I know growing up with my brother, we would see what the other created and be inspired to create something like that or take it even a step further and then just pass ideas back and forth that way. It was like collaborative and competitive at the same time.
I think, you couldn't have described it more accurately. I mean, I think temperamentally, Carl and I are probably the most competitive with one another. It might just be our dispositions. Marty's always had a softer disposition, and he's more nurturing. And but yeah, I definitely think the idea of wanting to, if not one up the other person, feeling like you're on your toes by what someone else has created. And I know that we've all three of us have experienced that. I mean, I've had conversations with both my brothers where, you know, I'll do something that I'm happy with and they'll be like, that was so good that now I'm feeling doubt about what I'm working on. But see, the thing is, it's like, I almost feel like I was the first to experience that feeling because it was all of my growing up of me thinking, oh, I could never be a musician. I'll never be a composer because look at my brothers. They're so talented. They're so great. Like, it's too late for me. And I was like 10, but it felt just hopeless to me. So it's interesting. But I do think that feeling for me, it's not really about being great. At the end of the day, it's just about like fitting in. It was about feeling like I could kind of stand on the same level as my brothers. And I imagine there's a part of that drive to just, you know, be like the big kids that's still influencing what I do in some way.
Yeah, I think it's always like, there's always that next level you're looking at and be like, but can I be like them? Like maybe Marty, and then after that it may be John Williams. And it's like, you know, there's always that next rung to fit in with.
There's always a hero, you know, there's always people that you look up to that inspire you, that give you confidence, but also completely shatter it when you feel that you're coming close to understanding their greatness, and then you'll discover something new or be reintroduced to some classic work of theirs and just feel defeated. But it's that mixture of love, reverence, and also jealousy that I think can really drive someone to be as good as they can be.
And something that I've noticed, actually, you might think it's like a linear scale of like, well, then who does the best person look up to? But it's something, especially interviewing musicians, that I've noticed. I've literally had it happen where I interview one musician and he talks about another musician, like about how amazing they are at a certain thing. Like he just does the best synth solos ever. I can't do those. And then I talk to that other musician and he talks about literally the musician who had talked about him saying, I don't know how he makes orchestras sound so good. And it's like, they're both looking up to each other for different aspects of music. So like John Williams might be admiring, you know, Hans Zimmer, who admires John Williams. They're just admiring each other for different aspects.
But they admire their differences. You know, I was having a conversation thinking about that. You know, John Williams, this great master of the orchestra, yet you know that there are people that, because he's just such a humble man, you know, he'll always talk about people who are more talented than them. And I'm scratching my head like, who is it? But I'm thinking, it's like, who does John Williams get intimidated by? And I really don't think it's another orchestral master. I don't think it's another person with the understanding of, you know, classical symphonic writing. It probably is somebody like a Thomas Newman or, you know, Hans Zimmer, who's just doing something so completely different.
Or like Eminem. John Williams, like, I can never rap like that. How will I ever drop a fat beat?
Well, I mean, we never know. We haven't heard him. He could have this secret skill.
That's actually a good point. But here's a question, Will. So you had a extremely musical childhood. When did video game music enter that for you? And like, why did that become a big focal point?
Video game music was there, honestly, right from the beginning. I've told this story on the podcast before, but the first piece of music that ever made me cry was the end credits to Super Mario 64. And I think it tells you what kind of person you're talking to, because most of the time I tell that story, people laugh and think I'm kidding. But I can tell them among friends when they go, yeah, oh, of course you would. Oh, definitely.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, staff roles, those are your thing.
Staff roles, yeah, honestly, end credits, oof. Video game music doesn't get any better. I could just talk all day about the amazing staff roles. But yeah, video game music was there from the beginning. I mean, there's footage of me like 3 years old running around the house in a Superman costume and just singing, you know, Sonic and singing Slider from Super Mario 64. I mean, I loved video game music. The first CD I ever got was a mix CD that Carl made for me of video game music, and I would listen to it on car trips. So it's always been there. And I think before music was my big passion as a kid, I think video games were my big focus. I mean, my parents, you know, would always try to encourage me to get out of the house and do sports and go outside and everything. But I think in my you know, deep down in my heart, what I really just wanted to do was play Nintendo games. And it was really an obsession. And I think what's cool, and I think one of the reasons I did love games so much, is because of the music. The music really, in any medium, kind of communicates what nothing else can. It's really like the soul of it, the emotional center. And I think what really was appealing to me about games was that it was something that no one was focusing on. It didn't seem like the rest of culture was really looking at it. I mean, these are more profound thoughts than I think a little kid was thinking, but just examining it now, I think is no one else was thinking of it as art, and nobody else was looking at this music as music. They all just thought it was functional. And to me, I think that's the thing that so inspired me about those composers. Someone like Koji Kondo, who to me is this unsung hero. I mean, everyone everywhere knows his music. The Super Mario Brothers theme is one of the most ubiquitous melodies in all of culture. I mean, Super Mario Brothers, Legend of Zelda, and for decades, I mean, he was the sole composer on those titles. And it's just a staggering number of music and themes that he's written. But growing up, it seemed like nobody knew who any of these people were, you know? And I mean, even still to this day, the average person can know the themes and won't know the name.
Even the average gamer, like I talk to people who know video games and I name drop Koji Kondo and they don't know who I'm talking about.
Yeah, they don't know Uematsu, they don't know Yuzo Koshiro. It's crazy.
You get in these communities and you forget how insular it is, even from people who love video games. Like,
right.
Yeah, it's not that widespread. I think another thing for me, I don't know if this was, you were in a more musical household, so this might have not been true for you, but for me, video games were introducing me to so many genres I wouldn't have heard otherwise as a kid.
You know, that's such a good point. It's kind of this interesting phenomenon, and it's definitely not what I think the designers were consciously intending. But I think I also noticed it, you know, watching childhood cartoons. You know, they'd be sending up some old movie cliche, or they'd be trying to do something musically in the style of some old composer. And none of the kids watching the show or playing the game had actually seen that thing. Like they're making some reference of like Dirty Harry or something. I'd never seen Dirty Harry, but you're introduced to it first through a different medium. And yeah, I totally agree with you, Brian. That's kind of like what games were. They kind of introduced you to a history of popular culture that you kind of were experiencing vicariously.
Yeah, because they were having to be really innovative for a lot of different, it was a totally new medium. So there were no rules. It wasn't like film or something where, you know, soundtracks were fairly well established. They were figuring everything out on the go at that period in time. So they were drawing from Latin, they were drawing from rock, they were drawing from just every imaginable genre.
Well, and from each other, it also seemed too like it was almost like it created its own aesthetic, its own sounds. It's something that Carl and I have talked about quite a bit on our podcast, specifically with composers from Japan, this idea that there's this game composer culture. Video game music became its own genre, its own style. There are so many common threads, whether it's chord progressions, whether it's melodic kind of character, whether it's just the general shape and rhythmic qualities of particular tunes, that really seems like so much video game music of the 80s and 90s all exists within the same style. You almost can't describe it, but you can tell, you know, when you hear another piece of music from a different genre and it just feels like, oh, that sounds like video game music, or it's video gamey. And nowadays that you can essentially have film composers work in games, and you can have anything from, you know, retro sounding things like something that Jake Kaufman would do, or, you know, you have Hans Zimmer working on games. It really kind of, that clarity of what game music is as its own style is not so much there anymore. But it's something that's still fascinating to me.
Absolutely. I think another thing from what I know of your style, a connection I would draw from video game music to you, and it's kind of a chicken and the egg thing for me, because I don't know if video games made you love this, or if you love this unless you love video game music, but it's the complete focus on melody, especially back in the 80s and 90s. But that's a huge part of your composition style too, right?
Yeah, I mean, you got me. Melody is what it's really all about for me. And I don't know. I don't know what came first. Again, I think the best thing I can do is just point to my brothers and their influence on not only my own personal musical style and my taste, but my philosophies as to how to approach music. I mean, it really came from so many conversations with Marty and Carl talking about what's so great about a particular melody, or examining two pieces of music and saying, like, you know, it was so much better when it was melodic, whether we're talking about, you know, old and new film music and where are the themes, and, you know, talking about old and new video game music and why the reason we love those retro game soundtracks is because they're so thematic. But it really became my life's obsession. Like, melody is my main love. Even before music, I still am continuously, you know, just in awe and wonder of a great melody, no matter where it's from. And I think that's the thing that I love about it, is music is so subjective, but in my mind, I don't know, a great melody is as close as it comes to being objective, because it makes you feel a certain way and it has a certain character, and you can analyze it and you can describe why it is that way, but it just is. The thing that I obsess over the most is the melody, just getting that to be as good as I think it can be. And it really is sort of the driving force of what I do, whether it's something that's orchestral, or whether it's a chiptune soundtrack, or whether it's a song. I really just care about having a good melody. Sometimes, I mean, other composers might think to my own detriment, because I think there's certain subtleties that a lot of composers have that comes out of melodic restraint, that they don't feel that they're always trying to have, you know, a tune in there. And I don't think I've ever really been in the situation where that's specifically been asked of me. But it's definitely not something that I choose to do. I almost always, no matter what I'm doing, even if I'm trying to make it sound intentionally minimal and modern, I always have a theme. I always have a melody, just because that's what interests me. A music that doesn't have it, I tend to get bored quickly. So we'll see where that takes me, and hopefully as I grow and develop, that I can gain more of an appreciation for letting the other aspects of music, just rhythm and harmony, sort of carry itself without the need for some kind of hooky theme. But as it stands right now, yeah, melody is king for me. It's my all-time favorite composers: Koji Kondo, John Williams, Tchaikovsky, Paul McCartney, anybody like that. It's really about the melodies are why I love them.
Melody is like dialogue in a film or a TV show, where it's what you're going to quote. It's what creates the characters. It's what kind of creates the through line. You can have a movie without dialogue that's incredibly visual and poetic and artistic and create mood, but you're not going to remember the story. You're not going to remember the characters the same that you are with dialogue.
Well, right. In the same way that you said you can't quote it. I mean, Brian, I think that's a brilliant analogy. And yeah, kudos to you for thinking that up. I think that really sums up my feeling on it. Yeah. I mean, you can have an emotional experience with a silent film. And maybe sometimes the most powerful moments are completely just visual, or, you know, in the case of film, when the music really gets to sing. But yeah, I mean, the dialogue is what you're going to be quoting. It's a catchy turn of phrase that I think can make something timeless. When we think of the classic American films that are still with us today, it's because we're still quoting us. You know, like I saw a poster the other day that said, "Well, do you, punk?" And you see that on all kinds of t-shirts, and so many people that may not have ever even seen that film, but they can quote that line. As much as you may be a fan of the score, the cinematography, or even the performance, it's like when it comes down to it, it's like that script, that dialogue is what makes something timeless. And I think that's sort of my obsession with melody, because as humans, the way we remember music is monophonically, which means, you know, one note at a time. That's why we're so attracted to melody, because we can sing a melody where you can't really sing a harmony. You can't sing a chord. You can't, it's just not possible, or it's not intuitive.
Yeah, I totally agree. And you speak about melodies being timeless. And one last thing that popped in my head about that was when you listen to music from different eras, almost always what people point out as cheesy or dated are the production values or the lyrics or something like that. It's the melody is almost always the thing that retains it despite the platform it's being played on. You can play a melody on, you know, an 8-bit channel, or you can play a melody with an orchestra, and it retains its strength on either of those.
Well, a melody is almost like an ancient language. I mean, you ever listen to like Latin or Sanskrit and feel like just the qualities of the words themselves almost like shake the foundations of the earth? Like they're so pure, they're tapped into almost like a spiritual energy. That's what I feel like a melody is. It's never going to date itself if it's doing its job. You know, where you're totally right. From year to year, we may listen to a production sound and think it sounds cliche or cheesy, or words, you know, lyrics. We may have a different cadence or different vocabulary and find that something doesn't hold up anymore. But a good melody will always be, because it is so unspecific and it's communicating to us directly through an emotional line.
So we've covered your composition style. Before we close out the interview, why don't we run through some of the stuff you've created with this and kind of where that came from? So you mentioned tribute albums. You did some of these with Carl and some on your own, correct?
Yeah. So the first one we did is called Of Cosmic Proportions, and it's a tribute to the Super Mario Galaxy games. It's still one of my favorite series of games when it comes to music, because it takes sort of the harmonic qualities, the melodic qualities of, to me, classic Mario music, but it delivers them through the medium of orchestra, which to me, I just have a love affair with the orchestra. I love it as a means of telling a story. I mean, it's this precious sort of sacred, time-tested entity that is sort of handed down to us from generations. And so what I so loved about that soundtrack is getting to hear, to me, the musical vocabulary of Koji Kondo through the vehicle of an orchestra. It was like heaven. It's like what I dreamed of as a kid. So I think we were so inspired by both the Mario Galaxy soundtracks. That's really what started this whole thing of tribute albums, was the idea of wanting to, as John Williams says when he's, writing more music for Star Wars, it's like adding paragraphs to the end of a letter. That's kind of how we felt, as if, let's say there's making a Mario Galaxy 3 and we're making the soundtrack for it. that's kind of how we approached it. And we've done tons of other things. We did an F-Zero album called Zero G. I've done multiple on my own Mario albums. I did something called Songs from Beyond the Warp Zone. And then I did something called Dear Mario, which is specifically sort of paying tribute to the music of Super Mario Brothers 3 in particular. I did an album called Child of the Chozo that I think I mentioned before, which is a tribute to Metroid, and it's done sort of as a comprehensive thing, trying to capture the sounds of not just one game, but the whole series. So it starts off, the first like third of the album is all 8-bit and, sequenced on FamiTracker and done the same way that I've done other NES stuff. And the second chunk of it is all Super Nintendo and is really kind of influenced by Super Metroid. And the last chunk of it is trying to sound like the Metroid Prime games. And what was exciting to me is the idea that could I, as one person, create the effect of almost not just one game, but an entire series of games and have themes that carry over from title to title. And again, it's really living in your imagination, but it was almost, it's like the extension of playing toys as a kid, playing with Star Wars figures and creating new stories with Han Solo and Luke Skywalker. That's what it kind of felt like. It's like, I loved the Metroid games. It almost felt like I got to take a step inside of them by doing that.
Yeah, I would love to do a whole episode on that one sometime, a whole interview on Child of the Chozo, because that was such a cool project, and I think stands out from a lot of like chip-tuned video game, not only because it's original music, but because people don't typically take like the GameCube era and make music based on that. Like, people don't go there. They always go SNES or Genesis or NES or something like that because they have such distinct, specific sounds. By the time you get to the GameCube, you're working a lot of general MIDI and that sort of stuff.
Well, and it was very well. Thanks, but I think the thing is, because it's so difficult, and we're too close to it. It's like now it's starting to become popular to do like disco again and popular music and do stuff that sounds like that. And pretty soon we're gonna get more synthy, and it's gonna be okay to do like a retro throwback to '80s stuff. But no one's sending up the early 2000s because we're just too close to it. It hasn't codified in our memory as a specific thing. And so that's the other thing that was really curious to me, is like, the Metroid Prime games are among my favorite video games. But is there enough in the soundtrack that people would identify as quaint and charming if I were to recreate it? And again, it was like, I didn't know the results of it, but that ended up being my favorite part of the album. I mean, trying to get the right general MIDI piano sound. I mean, for most of the time when you're a composer, at least for me, I'm trying to get the most realistic result. I'm trying to make it sound like an orchestra. I'm trying to get the performance just right. But this was this funny spot of trying to get it to sound fake enough.
Yeah. It's like, dang it, all of my instruments are too good. They don't sound...
Yeah. You can hear the sound of the hammer against the strings. I don't want it. I want it to sound just like one note sample that's being pitched up and down. It's a weird thing, but I got a tremendous high off of doing it, just because, again, it's like it made me appreciate those soundtracks all the more. And music that I would maybe dismiss as being weird or atmospheric or boring or whatever, I really gained an appreciation for how thoughtfully it was composed. And honestly, with the Metroid series, how consistent an identity it has from title to title, and how atmospheric Hip Tanaka was able to make the original NES Metroid, and how sophisticated Super Metroid sounds, and how they all kind of have this linkage, and it feels very specific and unique. It's something that, it's like, as good as my album is, it owes so much to those people. I could never claim full responsibility because it almost seems like the roadmap has already been laid out.
So now that you've finished up the tribute albums, what have you all been up to, or specifically you, what have you been up to making since then?
Recently, what I've been getting some joy out of is I just launched my own website, williambmusic.com, which is sort of a place where you can find, recordings of a lot of different music I've done, but the big reason why I wanted to do it was a place to have all of my sheet music, all of the scores for different like concert pieces that I've done in one place. And I think the thing that was important to me when creating the website is to kind of still have the identity of someone who is associated with game music. So on my original music page, which is just a SoundCloud embed that has a bunch of stuff that I've done, it was important to me to not just show off, choral music and orchestral and chamber music, but, to show off chip tunes and to show off, maybe lighter things that I've done for independent games, because it's really like a value of mine that stuff has equal worth to, just because it may not be taken as seriously culturally. I know as a composer that some of that stuff I'm much more proud of because it either took more work or I have more of an emotional connection to it. So I think I'll probably, until I'm dead, I'm always going to be an ambassador for game music and, the stuff that I love.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And so you have your newest album up there as well, which is not video game, but it is, of course, I'm sure, influenced by that in its own way, Axiom. And that's a collection of your symphonic and chamber music. Was that like stuff you're writing for school, or did you write this all independently?
It's a mixture of things, but to me, I mean, Axiom I made just to sort of commemorate the launch of the website, but it ended up being its own entity that I may be, more proud of than the site itself. And it's sort of, it's to Hollywood film music what a lot of our, not tribute albums, but just like a lot of our video game music is. To me, it's kind of... it's just a celebration of the kind of old Hollywood music tradition. And I think every piece on there, it's very sort of eclectic, so everything is different, but there's some stuff you might listen to that maybe it sounds like it's from like a 90s comedy film, and it may be like, what does that sound like? But when you hear it, you'll be like, oh, that is sort of whimsical, light orchestra music, and then you'll hear something that's very ostinato driven, and maybe that sounds more contemporary, and then you'll hear something very flourishy that might sound like something hopefully from a John Williams score. So it's kind of a collection of different pieces that I happen to have written throughout high school and college, and also some new things that were written for the purposes of the album. But it was just a nice way for me to collect, some of the stuff were pieces that I've actually had performed by real orchestras and things that I've done initially for school. So in some of the stuff were actual independent film scores that I've done. So it was just a collection of symphonic and chamber music written in kind of a Hollywood style.
And that's great with the website launch, because it's almost like a portfolio or sampling of different stuff you can do all packed into one album.
Yeah, that's kind of what I thought, is that I wanted to make it something that the experience of a listener would be like, oh, wow, I hope this guy is, working in movies, because that's ultimately what I really want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I encourage everyone to check out williambmusic.com and then head over. We'll have a link in the show note as well. Head over to the music page and You can pick up Axiom, Child of the Chozo, D. Mario, and also head over to Super Marcato Bros and find the rest of their music there. There's a lot of it. There are like 20 albums on that site or something, maybe more.
Right. Yeah, more than almost 30. It's crazy. I can't believe it's happened. But it was kind of fun. Carl and I both launched websites on the same day, and we both I kind of had the idea of like, what if we each release an album on the day that the websites come out to commemorate it? And so just to kind of show the differences of our style, I did like an orchestral album, and Carl did this fusion synth album called Back in Orbit. And I think they both have a lot of elements of video game music in them, but they're also so different. It kind of shows what's different about us.
Shows your styles really well. And yeah, Steven's actually going to have an interview with Carl as well, either in the episode right before this one or right after. So if any listener wants to hear his perspective, hear more about Groove, then check out the episode with Carl and you can get all those details. So
I love all this, again, brother to brother cross-pollination. It's great.
All right, Will. Well, thanks so much for your time. That was awesome. And we didn't talk about it much because we kind of mentioned it before, but yeah, Super Marcato Brothers, if anyone's looking for another video game music podcast, can't recommend one more. If you want to hear people analyze, basically imagine it's the playlist segment from this show, except in between each song, you get people analyzing the music from a composing background. You get Carl and Will every week doing that, and it's wonderful. Well, thanks so much, Will.
Yeah, thanks, Brian.
And we're going to head back to the show. You've been listening to a segment from the OverClocked PodCast, the official podcast of ocremix.org. If you'd like to hear more, check out the rest of the channel, or get the full episodes from iTunes or your podcast provider of choice. And for more video game music and remixes, check out ocremix.org.